Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
Good morning. Delighted to have everybody here this morning for a discussion that I know will be very exciting and enlightening. This is part of the McKinsey Executive Roundtable series in international economics. I would start by the admonition of please turn off cell phones, Blackberries, anything that might buzz, jingle, ring, attract attention to itself. And I will remind everyone this particular panel is on the record. So just know that. As I said at the onset, this is going to be, I think, and can predict a very lively discussion. You have up here, I'm not going to go through their bios simply because you have them, but you couldn't have a more distinguished panel, frankly, to discuss this issue covering economics and environmental understanding of climate change. For the purposes of today's panel, what we'll do is make the assumption that the climate is changing and that human activity is having some impact on that. You can debate that if you want. That's fine, but I think we'll start with that premise and ask the panel to take us through their understanding of the issue and its economic implications and some of the things that we are seeing being proposed today as ways of addressing the issue and what their economic consequences are. Because as we were discussing over breakfast, there are some areas where we have seen to some unintended consequences, to some unanticipated, although I think most of us could have forecast that something would happen when you move to something like corn-based ethanol and what impact that's having on the food supply around the world, not just in this country. But leaving that aside for the moment, what I'd like to do is throw open just the broadest question. What is the best approach to climate change? There are a lot of things being suggested out there. There are a lot of areas for discussion. Right now, the focus seems to be on taking economic measures, whether it's a tax on carbon, a cap-and-trade program, regulatory, doing it strictly through regulation, getting Congress to act. I'd like first to have the panel discuss a little bit about how they've approached and looked at this issue of climate change and what they see off the top of their heads at the beginning of probably what they feel is the best way to start to try to approach it. And maybe I'll just go down the line. And Ian, start with you.
Okay, well, we favor economy-wide approaches to reducing emissions where you place a price on the carbon content of all fossil fuels in the economy. And as that price is passed forward into fuel prices and electricity prices, that's going to exploit all low-cost opportunities for abatement throughout the economy. There are two approaches to gauge in the appropriate price. This broad-based approach is far better than just trying to pick winners or placing the entire burden of emissions reductions on the transportation sector or the power sector. Far better, far more cost-effective to have an economy-wide approach where you raise the price of all activities which involve carbon emissions, and so you exploit all of the low-cost options for abatement throughout the economy. In the economics literature, there are two approaches to gauging the appropriate price that we should put on emissions. First is sort of a benefit-cost approach where we attempt to measure the damages from current emissions in terms of the future global warming potential. So here we're assessing to what extent emissions today will lead to future global climate change and have impacts on agriculture, risks to human health, perhaps through the spread of tropical disease. That's going to raise sea levels, so we need to take into account the costs of protecting against rising sea levels and the loss of land that won't be protected. We also need to take into account the possibility, the risks of more extreme climate scenarios knocking out large portions of world GDP. So there is a substantial literature that attempts to do this. And most of the estimates come up with a price of about $5 to $20 per ton of CO2. Now, most of the studies use conventional or market discount rates, which some have objected to on ethical grounds. But if you take the view that we should discount these long-range damages to bring them to translate them into current dollars, then you pretty much end up with a range of about $5 to $20 per ton of CO2. And if you implemented that policy, it would cut near-term emissions by something like about 5 to 15%, but then you would progressively ramp up the policy over time. Just to give you some idea, a $10 price on CO2 would increase coal prices by about 60%, but it would only increase the price of gasoline by about 9 cents per gallon due to differing carbon intensities of those fuels. Now, obviously, some analysts are not comfortable with this benefit-cost approach because it can't really handle the possibility of really extreme climate scenario, like a runaway greenhouse effect causing a warming of, say, 20 degrees Celsius. So instead, these analysts focused on emissions pricing paths over time that would be consistent with ultimately stabilizing global warming at acceptable levels. So if you want to limit warming to about 3 degrees Celsius over the longer term, really you should be pricing CO2 in the order of about $5 to $20 per ton now. But if, as many scientists think, we should be trying to limit expected warming to 2 degrees Celsius over the longer term, really we should have a much more aggressive policy, and we should be pricing emissions in the order of about $25 to $70 per ton of CO2. Right now, the price of CO2 in the European trading system is about $35, so they're on the fairly aggressive end. And then just finally, as regards the instrument, I think that ideally we should implement this emissions price through a revenue-neutral tax on CO2, on the carbon content of fossil fuels, with credits for downstream sequestration activities like carbon capture at power plants, and also credits for forestry sequestration. But the advantage of a revenue-neutral CO2 tax is that you use the revenues from carbon taxes, which for a $10 or $20 price on CO2 would be around $50 to $100 billion a year. So you're talking about a lot of revenues. But if those revenues were used to cut other taxes in the economy, such as income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, those taxes are all distortionary in the sense that they're a deterrent to work incentives or savings and investments, and studies show that when you use revenues to cut the rates of these other taxes, you get a significant economic benefit, and that helps to keep down the overall costs of the policy. So I would put the costs to the economy of a revenue-neutral CO2 tax of, say, $10 to $20 in the order of about $1 to $8 billion per year, which to my mind isn't that substantial. On the other hand, if we used a cap-and-trade system where you give all the allowances away for free, or you go ahead with a revenue-neutral, with a carbon tax, but you don't specify revenue neutrality up front in the legislation, so there's a risk that the revenues might ultimately fund wasteful public spending, then the costs of these, well, depending on your point of view, maybe it'll fund some socially desirable programs, but if it doesn't, if the revenue is wasted and not used productively, the costs of these policies are substantially higher. So I would put the costs of cap-and-trade systems with free allowance allocation that placed a price on CO2 emissions in the order of $10 to $20 at about $15 to $40 billion per year. So that's a much more substantial cost. Then the other argument for a CO2 tax is that it fixes the price of emissions, and this helps to create a stable environment for firms to invest in clean technology or energy R&D, unlike under a cap-and-trade system where the price of the emissions permits could be quite volatile. So if instead we were to go ahead with a cap-and-trade system, I think it's very important, first of all, that in the legislation, we include provisions to limit the volatility of the permit prices. In particular, I think it's important to allow firms to bank allowances during periods when there's downward pressure on permit prices and borrow allowances when there's upward pressure on permit prices. And the European trading system's moving in that direction. There's now they do have full allowance banking, but they don't allow firms to borrow permits. So that system's still vulnerable. If there's, say, for example, a shock to natural gas prices, the European trading system is still vulnerable. That could really jack up the permit price and cause severe disruption. So it's a pity they don't include borrowing provisions in the European trading system. And then finally, if we were to go ahead with a cap-and-trade system, in addition, I think that we should auction most or all of the allowances and then use the bulk of that revenue to cut other taxes. And again, the European trading system, it's moved away from essentially 100% free allowance allocation, and the plan is now to transition to 100% allowance auctions by 2020, although it's not quite clear how that revenue would be used.
Well, Richard, as someone who is actually doing it here in this country with the Chicago Climate Exchange, what's your take on this approach, on the various approaches?
Christy, maybe I just, for the audience's sake, to put something in perspective, we generally talk about several approaches. One is a command and control approach where you just simply say reduce emissions by 20%. Then in the category of other policy tools, you have what are called flexible mechanisms, one being a tax, and two being cap and trade. And what cap and trade does, it says, okay, you have to reduce by economy-wide, let's say 20%, but it allows the flexibility for those who can reduce emissions by more than the 20% to sell them to others who for some reason need environmental siting, takes 3 years to install equipment, etc. So they can hedge themselves by buying other people's reductions. We're driven, Christy, by the EPA's SO2 program, which, according to the EPA, and emissions were to be reduced under the Clean Air Act of 1990 by 100%, or cut in half, from 18 million to 9 million tons. The act was passed in 1990. We indeed, economy-wide, have cut them from 8 to 9 million. The allocation was free. The price has been very volatile. The EPA estimates that 1 to 3 billion is the nationwide cost annually. In 2010, the savings associated with reduced medical expenses will be 100 billion annually. So there's a model of probably the most successful public program that we've ever had, which includes free allocation, simple cap and trade, and no taxes. We happen to operate 3 exchanges worldwide. I'm the executive chairman of a company called Climate Exchange, and we were very privileged to have Christy as one of our founding directors. And Climate Exchange, the holding company, operates 3 exchanges. One in Europe, the European Climate Exchange. We have about a 91% market share. We traded about $40 billion last year, and we're running at about double the rate now. And it implements both CERs, which are a UN tool to transfer technologies from the developing world to it, and it operates the European Union allowance system. In the United States, so we either operationalize public policy, as the Kyoto Protocol in Europe, or in America, we have something called the Chicago Climate Exchange, which is a legally binding but voluntary program. And it was started with a grant, and I think Paula DePernis here, or the Joyce Foundation funded us in 2000 to see if we could get a voluntary program going. And everybody said, you'll never get it off the ground. And the only reason we wanted to get it going was because we anticipated that U.S. policy would go there. From the moment we got the grant to when we started, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. I don't mean some of the things, but everything went wrong. We got the grant, and then the president pulled out of Kyoto, and we were told nobody would ever join an exchange without the threat of public policy or public policy. That was followed by 9/11, the Afghan war, the dot-com bursting, the stock market crashing, Enron imploding, a deep recession, and a war in Iraq. And that was the wonderful background of kick-starting this company. We now have 11% of the Fortune top 102 companies, Abbott Labs, Ford, Safeway, International Paper, Motorola, 17% of the Dow Jones, IBM, Intel, DuPont, United Technologies, most recently Bank of America as an emitter okay, because they own so much building and burn so much fossil fuel. 20% of the top power companies, American Electric Power, Detroit Edison, Alliant, Reliant in Texas, TECO, NRG, Allegheny, etc. 2 states, New Mexico and Illinois, 7 cities, Chicago all the way to Melbourne, universities from Tufts in the east and most recently Scripps and UCSD in the west, a group of companies that represent 16% of the United States stationary source emissions. And if we were a country, we would be the largest trading country in the world. Our emission baseline is 550 million tons, which is bigger than Germany under the EU scheme. I mention all of this in the context of the criticisms that are sometimes waged saying you could never do this. And the fact is we've done it. It cost us $5 million. The European Union, the United Kingdom's pilot program cost $300 million. Our members were required to reduce emissions by 4%, and they've actually done it by 10%. The cumulative reductions are 180 million tons, which is actually close to the output of France and Belgium combined under the EU baseline. So the message is it's being done. It is simple. We will basically operationalize the national policy when either McCain, Obama, or Clinton gets their cap and trade bill. And the only message I can say to you is a lot simpler than anybody believes. You know, it is easy to implement. It's no cost to the public. It's all borne by private investors. We trade futures in SO2, about 4 or 5 billion a year. We trade NOx futures. We're implementing, and the message is, and to John Phelan, the capital markets give some incentives to people, and there'll be a lot of changes in behavior. Markets work. Set the price too high, above the marginal cost of abatement, and people build technology. The price is below marginal cost of abatement, then they buy allowances. And as long as Zian said you can bank them and you can do a lot of ways to fix the actual architecture of the market, it's pretty easy to implement. So we're humble operators of exchanges, and we have a joint venture in Montreal, and we've just signed an MOU with PetroChina to explore emissions trading in China, where we have 5 members, and we have 5 Indian members in exploring an effort there. And I guess the message I'd like to get across is the markets are already moving. They are getting globally linked, and they are beginning to see meaningful reductions and having, I believe, attaining reductions at the least possible cost.
I would ask then Dr. Socolow to say, do we need to do anything?
Well, for God's sake, yes. No, one way to start is to think that for a group like you and the audience here, this is a risk management issue. The IPCC got a Nobel Prize, and I think people didn't truly identify its most important contribution, which was that it has spent a lot of time clarifying how large the uncertainties are in this problem. And when they pose the consequences of climate change, there is a very wide error bar. And we could be lucky or unlucky, and that's all inside the picture of the world that is being displayed by the IPCC. So it is about buying insurance, and is about terrible outcomes versus much less terrible outcomes. And then we are going to be betting the planet, and we have to react at some appropriate level. My simple way of thinking about this problem is to follow the carbon atom. It's coming out of the ground. 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide are going into the atmosphere. When the carbon that's coming each year, when the carbon that comes out of the ground is burned. That's our number today, globally. U.S. is a little under a quarter, say 7 billion tons of CO2. The atmosphere is going to tell the truth. We're going to be able to keep track of that number. There are an awful lot of ways of kidding ourselves. And it's a very sticky system. We've got lots of things we're committed to right now, from the interior decorating and the view of what's a well-lit room, through to the vehicles we've become very enamored of and are using in more and more creative ways. So this is going to be hard. I do not think the word simple is correct. I think we have institutions that are going to make a big difference. But, for example, a very important principle is measure. We've got to spend a lot of time not giving awards for buildings that look attractive and are supposed to do X, but measure them after the fact. And we don't like to do that. I've been involved with energy efficiency in buildings as an area for 35 years. The message has never really been accepted for good reason. Who wants to know that their pet project didn't work? Many of you are in the business of measurement. You know the importance of measurement. We're going to have to make that very critical when we start talking about what a given utility or company has saved or not saved. I'm not saying these savings weren't realized, but we don't know if they were realized. Another one of these temptations is the offset method. We have offsets trading at a different price from the high quality product. That tells you there's something inferior about them, and we have the way I model that in my head is that we have bonds rated AAA all the way to junk, and we will have the same thing going on. We will have transactions that make people feel good or that carry high risk, but that don't get the job done. And so we've got a very serious challenge. My goal, to have a goal in people's minds that's easy to keep track of, it would be keep the same emissions globally as today some number of years in the future, 25, 50, 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide emitted on the planet in 2030. That is a much more modest goal than the one that people were talking about in Bali. They don't want to settle for that. I say keep that in mind and take that as a target. The U.S. will have to come down from our current 7 billion tons for the world to stay at 30. I mean, we are just too prosperous relative to everybody else. We have the investment capital and so forth. So we have to do less than our current emissions 25 years from now. How are we going to do that? Well, it's not that hard to track the carbon atom. 40% of the carbon atoms come out of our power plants, 60% out of everything else. Globally, in the U.S., fractions is a little lower than the world average at maybe 35 because we've got more coming out of vehicles. And the third category is stationary emissions, where furnaces are. The power plant and the building go hand in hand. 70% of the electricity emitted from a power plant is consumed in a building, with motors, with lights, with air conditioning equipment, and other appliances. We build power plants because we're building buildings, not very well. China's building power plants because it's building buildings, not very well. 1-to-1, practically. So we've got to deal with the building sector, which tends to get lost when you say transport and power. So we have to go across the entire economy. One of the troubles with cap and trade, or one of the challenges, and put it more positively, of cap and trade, is to catch enough of the carbon to catch most of the carbon. The Europeans are settling for about half of the carbon emissions in their economies right now, with what is by far the most exciting and adventurous policy initiative, which is to put a serious price on carbon. They got it wrong the first time around, had too many allowances, and I thought, well, they'd get discouraged. But January 1 of this year, they're starting round 2, and there's a political commitment there to keep the price around $35 a ton of CO2. And so the other thing I want to say is you want a price high enough that things happen. You can't get the price from cost-benefit analysis. We don't know how to do the benefits. These risks are uncertain in probability as well as magnitude. And so we have to work backwards from saying what will a given price induce? And what will a given price induce when coupled with specific policies that make those alternatives more appealing? If you want to put CO2 below ground, we need a policy regime for crediting CO2 below ground, which we know we can do, but it's going to take some serious effort and some practice before we get there. We need to induce renewables. We need to induce efficiency in buildings. We will have to do, I call it price plus. It's my shorthand. And the plus is a whole set of targeted initiatives which don't pick a particular technology, but do say, if we put CO2 underground, we're going to have to learn how to do it. And we're going to have to practice it at large scale in lots of places at once. And then we've got to build infrastructure. Christy and I were talking about that at the breakfast table. Should roll off the tongue that we've got an investment in infrastructure that is not going to get made through a cap and trade or a tax system. It's going to be made by any more than our highways were built that way. Well, they were built, well, we can think about that. They were built in part by a gasoline tax. We have to build an infrastructure for power. If we have renewables, and they have to be brought 1,000 or 2,000 miles to a load, that's almost surely we don't have an electricity system today, electricity transmission system, that resembles the highway system. It isn't a national system. We probably need to go there if we're going to move electricity a couple of thousand miles. So we need integrity, we need commitment, we need a high enough price that we don't end up with, my shorthand is mitigation light, L-I-T-E. Avoid mitigation light. That will require these higher prices that Europe has. And we can kid ourselves and have a lower price and have all the right words and an awful lot of tax paying and trading, but not reduce the carbon emissions. So we're going to have to work backwards from what does it take to get the carbon emissions of this country down, and how are we doing and keeping score. And it's relatively easy to keep score because the carbon comes out of the ground in this country or comes across a border, and you know what that is every year. The energy industries do a very good job with carbon bookkeeping. So we'll be able to keep track of it. We have to have on everybody's, most of you don't know probably that we put 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And if in this group, a third of you do, in the public, 1% does. So we've got to get that number on the front page of of USA Today every day or every month or something. So we actually focus on a goal or the equivalent. So as I say, follow the carbon atom and realize how easy it's going to be to kid ourselves. And I guess the two final things would be, one, every one of the solutions can be done badly. And we've got to acknowledge that. There isn't a wonderful alternative. Conservation can bring unpleasant and self-defeating regimentation. The nuclear problem really can go well or badly, and it has to be done globally to make a difference. And with institutions we have right now, it will probably increase the chances of nuclear war. So we've got to improve those institutions. And we can't think of the world as two tiers, good people and bad people. We're going to have to assume bad people and have a single system that works. And coal has to be cleaned up upstream as well as with carbon dioxide capture and storage. And finally, in the global scheme, we've got to find a way, and I think we can come up with one, where it is acknowledged that there are rich people in poor countries. At the present time, half of the carbon emissions in the world are coming from the developed world and half from the non-developed world. If you take OECD to be the developed world, 50-50, a little more than 50 now in the developing world. It crossed a few years back. And yet, per capita emissions in the developing world are 1/5 of per capita emissions in the developed world because there are 5 times as many people in the developing world. So we've got to keep both facts in mind. We can't any longer give the free pass to the developing world a few years after the framework we set up in 1992 in the Rio Convention did not have any time at which the developing world initiatives kick in. It's indefinite free pass. In the Montreal Protocol, there was a 10-year forgiveness period. There's an infinite forgiveness period in the way Rio was set up. The grace period has to be over. We have to say with our developing country partners, you have as many emissions as we do. It comes largely from people living approximately as we do, who are a small fraction of your population, a much larger fraction of ours. But we are in this together. Our lifestyles are parallel. One of the things that I found extraordinary was this India World Bank grant last week and saying this is going to help the poor people in India. No, it's going to air condition office buildings in India. We've got to deal with the fact that we have to all have the same programs because we're all living the same way. Those billion of us out of 6 billion people, about 1 billion of us are putting most of those carbon atoms into the atmosphere by living well.
Well, before I turn it over to the audience here for questions, I would like to follow up just on what you finished talking about and throw it out to the panel. Is it practicable to think of an economic model that would allow for the continued economic growth of the developing countries with a carbon intensity target, whereas an absolute carbon reduction target for the developed nations? Or is that something that would so skewer the economics in any kind of system that regime you try to put in place that you can't do that kind of a separation?
Really quick answer is that there's nothing wrong with a cap, which gets larger with time, as long as it's getting larger with time more slowly than the economy would have done without that cap. So China could have a cap that grows at 1% a year or 2% a year when its economy was set to, carbon emissions were set to grow 5% a year, and you would have carbon trading. You don't have to mix intensity and cap.
Yeah, I would agree totally with the comments that were just made. I think you could reach for a smaller growth rate, and actually we find that the people that we talk to, and we work with Todd and a few people in India and a few people in China, and they seem to be open to the fact that if they could grow at a lower rate but continue to grow so that they would have political stability, be able to feed the people and have a standard of living. And I think if you couple that, and I would go much more aggressive maybe than you might, Bob, I would cut or I would hope the cap and trade legislation that's before Congress would cut emissions here in the United States by 50, 60%, and maybe up to 80% over a long period of time.
I didn't give a number, but I wouldn't disagree with you.
Oh, okay. Then I think you could cut it very aggressively in the United States as long as you allowed the glide path of industry to adjust. You did what SO2 did. You made it very light in the early years. People learn, and then you ratchet it down. And I think if you had aggressive policies in the European Union, in the United States, and a policy like Bob was mentioning in the developing world, you could achieve the goals of 30 billion or even less. And again, just to put it in an economist's terms and in somebody who runs a market, that carbon promises to be the largest commodity in the world. If you take a look at, and John, you'll appreciate this, if you take carbon at $35, roughly euro prices, you take 30 billion and just do the arithmetic, that's a worldwide crop of carbon of $1 trillion a year. Yep. Okay, just multiply those two. If you take derivatives markets, they tend to trade 10 to 30 times the underlying crop. So the corn production is, the corn futures will trade 10 times, beans will trade 20 times, treasury bonds will trade 30 times. So we're talking about a market that promises to be anywhere from 10 to 30 trillion a year, ultimately. And by the way, I think it's reasonable because you tell me what the marginal value of air is, and I will say to you that you can't live on this planet without air, so why shouldn't these public goods be valued at enormous prices? They deliver life, and they have to be rationed.
Beijing is facing some of that with the upcoming Olympics, no question about it. Ian, did you have one answer?
Well, just quickly, I mean, I think ultimately, ideally we should be aiming for a uniform price on CO2 throughout the whole world. It might take us 50 years to get there, I don't know, but that's the ultimate goal because that's the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions when every country throughout the world is facing the same price on CO2. But clearly that's going to place greater burden on countries which have greater emissions intensity relative to GDP than others. But I'm optimistic there are ways that independent assessments can be made to gauge, well, what would be a fair system of side payments among countries to address these distributional or equity issues, that we could come up with formulas for saying, well, if a particular country, based on its per capita income and based on its emissions intensity, it's got a relatively much higher burden than a bunch of other countries. I think there are ways that countries could agree on some formulas for side payments to roughly compensate for these concerns. And that's what they've done within the European trading system. Every country within the European trading system, whether it's Britain, Germany, or Romania, which is has a substantially lower per capita income than the other countries, every country has the same price on emissions. But the European countries have come up with an agreed-upon formula to redistribute some of the emissions allowances away from the relatively wealthy countries to the relatively poor countries to make it worthwhile for the poor countries to still be in the agreement. So I guess I'm optimistic that that type of formula could be more widely developed as other countries come into a broader international agreement.
Okay, it's now time to open it to the audience. I'd ask that you raise your hand. There are microphones. Wait till the microphone gets to you. If you would stand and state your name and affiliation and limit yourself to one question, that would be wonderful. Okay, in the back there. Wait till the mic gets to you.
Thank you. Stephen Cass from Cartilage in Millburn. My question is for Professor Socolow. Cap and trade relies on, and in particular in its clean development mechanism, relies upon some independent verification for the avoided emissions. Since both parties to a transaction have the similar incentive to inflate that number, these are supposed to be independently verified. Absent that, you may not be assured, as you indicated, that we're actually going to get the emissions reductions that cap and trade promises. How much confidence do you have in the ability of independent verifiers to perform that essential function, particularly in view of the failure, for example, of the accounting industry to perform that in certain other well-known areas?
I think it's harder than that. It's harder than just doing accounting well. And I have very little confidence that offset process is going to save a lot of carbon, because not only is the question what actually happened, but you have the tougher question: what would have happened if you hadn't had this transaction? This is the issue called additionality. It's extremely difficult to say that something wouldn't have happened, and you have perverse consequences, such as a country, and this is going on right now, declines to pass a law that would save carbon so that the offset will be demonstrably producing the carbon saving. So I think this international offset thing is really flawed, it's deeply flawed. And my view is that the developing countries, particularly the ones that are emerging and or whatever, transitional, growing rapidly, should have their own carbon policies at a national level that set a tax or a cap and trade, as we've just been talking about it. And there will be no cherry picking from outside. And that offset will be just an investment in that country as any other investment. And I think it's worse than just bad accounting, the consequences. There is a lot of money being made on any transaction, but these are really perverse in many directions.
Richard?
Yeah, I would agree that there are problems and they will be addressed, but I think we have to be guided by the fact that no matter how imperfect it might be, and no matter how you might get it right, as Bob said earlier, or wrong, you might over-allocate. I think that you've got to take action, and you cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There will be measurement problems. In some instances, they will be monitoring and verification is very easy. At the EPA, they put continuous emission monitors on stacks, and those are, well-known, easy technologies. You can monitor anaerobic manure digesters and the methane that's taken out in some of those CDM projects, and there are independent verifiers, and the UN has been careful and loath. As a matter of fact, the criticism is that they're going too slow and spending a lot more time on monitor and verification. But we are getting an infrastructure. They will not work perfectly like any market will, and it will have its problems from time to time as you implied about the current conditions that exist in today's capital markets. But overall, I think we've got to move, and we've got to take action and recognize we're going to get some things wrong, and we're going to get some things right, and we'll change those things as they did in Europe, and they'll change the protocols that they are at the UN, but the choice is not for us to make. This is such a serious problem that we've just got to get on with it and do the best we can. I'm driven by Santayana's quote, the great Harvard philosopher in the 19th century, who said, nature rules with a loose rein, and a vitality of any sort will mutter through any predicament in which reason would despair. So I think you're meant to take action, recognize that you'll bang into a wall, assess the damage, and go after the wall again. And I think humankind, and you got people like Vinod Khosla working on cellulosic ethanol because he thinks he can make some money. You've got Craig Ventnor just raised $200 million based upon a $6 price in carbon to go out for 3 years and get genetically modified bacteria that eat sulfur and eat carbon. I mean, there's a lot of creativity, and you put this price on it, you're going to get a whole green tech industry. I'd rather do that and have some errors in the system and police them and get rid of them than not have a UN process that deals with CERs. Recognizing that I think 99% will be okay and maybe 1% we won't get right, but that the goal is to do something.
Yeah,
Anything
I
to that?
agree.
Okay. Another question right there. Two of them coming at you.
Thank you. I'm Mark Levinson with J.P. Morgan Chase. I had a question for Ian Parry. As an economist, I'd like to believe that prices change behavior, but I think that the empirical evidence shows that that's really not always true. Particularly in the area of transport, all the evidence is that price elasticity of demand is extremely low, and in fact is swamped by the income elasticity. When people get richer, they drive more, they fly more, and an increase in the price of doing that really doesn't make a whole lot of difference to them. How do you deal with that in the context of reducing carbon emissions from vehicles? What kind of mechanism do you think here works, other than, frankly, a command and control type of mechanism?
Yeah, no, you're right that the behavioral responses in the transportation sector are very limited because you don't have, at the moment, you don't have many alternatives to conventional motor fuels. So, for example, the evidence suggests that if you increase the price of gasoline by 10%, over the long run, as people drive their vehicles less and they demand more fuel-efficient vehicles, you'll maybe cut fuel consumption by about 4%. So there's some response, but it's pretty modest. And that's why when studies look at what happens when you impose a uniform price on CO2 throughout the economy, a relatively modest portion of the emissions reductions comes from the transportation sector. There's a much greater response within the power sector, where there's more scope for fuel substitution, substituting away from coal to natural gas and to renewables, and possibly down the road incorporating carbon capture and storage. So, yeah, I mean, it's tough in the transportation. I mean, unless there's some additional market imperfection within the transportation sector, I wouldn't necessarily recommend any supplementary measures. I think, if you're not happy with the it is tough. You have to impose these $5 to $20 prices on CO2, and even then you're only going to cut emissions by 5 to 15% in the near term. You do need stiff prices to get substantial reductions, but I would be in favor, if you're not happy with the progress on economy-wide emissions reductions, then I think you should jack up the economy-wide price rather than trying to guess, oh, well, this sector's not pulling its weight, therefore we should have supplementary additional regulations on that sector. Unless there's some specific market imperfection that's been identified and there's evidence that there's a clear market failure there. And, these are open issues in the literature. There are some people think that people undervalue fuel economy improvements from vehicles, and therefore we should have, and that's a justification for tightening CAFE standards in addition to raising carbon prices or gasoline prices. And other people think that people undervalue the energy savings from more efficient appliances or heating systems or fridges or whatever, and therefore they think that in addition to raising the price on carbon emissions throughout the economy, we should have supplementary measures tightening energy efficiency standards. But those are issues that are much disputed amongst analysts. There's not much evidence on whether there are actually these additional market failures or not. But if it turns out, if future evidence suggests that there is these additional market failures, then yes, in principle, they justify some supplementary measures. But if there isn't evidence of these supplementary market failures, I would just say raise the economy-wide price on emissions if you're not happy with the progress on emissions reductions, and then just let the market decide which are the most cost-effective ways to respond to the higher price.
Let me just add a little something on that, because just last year, as you probably, I hope everybody here knows about the Energy Star program of the Environmental Protection Agency and Department of Energy. Last year, purchases of Energy Star products to go to the uncertainty that you were putting out there, reduced the carbon equivalent of taking 27 million cars off the road and saved the necessity of building 50 new power plants in this country. So there's a way to measure, and there are some very measurable results that are real from the voluntary programs. It doesn't mean that that's enough, but you really can measure them. We have another question over there. We have lots of questions. I'll try to get around it.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Shang Jingwei from Columbia University's Graduate School of Business. I have two short international questions on international dimensions of the problem. First question is addressed to Drs. Parry and Dr. Sandor, and the second question can be to any of the panelists. One of the objections, when developing countries like China, India, and Brazil make a lot of arguments against joining any international agreement that's binding on them, and some are excuses, some are plausible arguments. One of the plausible arguments I've heard is that industrialized countries during the last 120 years have emitted lots of stuff, without paying for it, and why should now they be subject to binding doing the same thing? Now the question is, what is the best? Suppose we just, industrialized country, give them the credit of all the emissions we have, but in the form of a dedicated technical assistance. What is the best estimate on the cost to us in dollar amounts, number one, and whether it's feasible or not? That's question number one. Question number two, also on the national dimension. I do research on corruption, tax evasion, accounting fraud, and so on. And one of the questions in this area is, verifiability. So I imagine some of the emission activities are easily checked, verified, measured. Others are perhaps less so. And so this is maybe an engineering question, maybe enforcement question, maybe economic question. Question is, how difficult is it to properly measure and verify those emission activities once a global binding activity agreement is in place, particularly monitoring those activities in a developing country? Thank you.
Richard, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, the first question on equity, I think, Professor Socolow spoke to it earlier, and I believe is the right approach, is that to equalize that and to make sure there's political stability, you would not demand a cut from them. You would just have a increasing rate, but not quite as high as it might be in order to get a political buy-in from them. And I think that at some particular point with China's economy, GDP, it's now the second biggest economy. It just passed Japan. There'll be a buy-in. Maybe it'll take 5 or 6 years of slower rates of growth, but I think there will be. And India similarly. India with only a 8-9% GDP growth rate won't be as much. But I think Professor Sokolow's approach is, just reach for the stabilization. As far as the corruption, it's unambiguously a problem. I mean, and it's a problem that you have to address very, very carefully. The monitoring and verification, you can in cases of China has an SO2 program, and it has what are called scrubbers, which are chemical factories that take the sulfur out of the flue gas. Well, you know, I've heard of instances where they just turn them off, you know, or jig with them, and I'm sure it's done in the U.S. I'm sure it's done around the world with different degrees of dishonesty, but you have to recognize that this will go on and build your enforcement procedures as tightly as possible. And I think just like in the criminal system, you won't catch everybody, but if you get a good enough job done, you'll catch 98% of them.
Ian, did you address to you and then Bob?
Well, just quickly, I mean, to bring in developing countries, we've got to make it worthwhile. For them. In a sense, they've got to be made better off from being in the agreement, from being outside the agreement, which clearly, to my mind, means that we're going to have transitory side payments to make them really want to be in the agreement. And then once we've got them wanting to be in the agreement because they're getting this compensation, either in a tax system, this would just be some of the tax revenue from the wealthier countries gets redistributed according to some formula to the developing countries, or under a cap and trade system, you'd bring them into the trading system but give them relatively lax emissions targets, possibly even have quotas for them which are about at their current emissions levels, possibly even a little bit greater, to give them some incentive to want to join the coalition. And once they have that incentive, then you can say, look, to be in this coalition and to make you better off, we have to develop some accounting practices to measure the fossil fuels, and we have to have international inspectors coming in, and if the program's focused on fossil fuels, which it shouldn't be a downstream program. It's much harder to track CO2 in a downstream program that's focused on the power sector, on the transportation sector. Far better to have it upstream on the fossil fuels, and just keep track of all the fossil fuels produced in the economy and coming into the economy, and just develop accounting procedures that can be verified by international inspectors to account for the fossil fuels, and then we know the emissions factors for those fossil fuels. In addition, there's various downstream activities like carbon capture and sequestration, but there again, we can say, well, if you want to be in this agreement, we have to verify when you have carbon capture, and therefore you have to have continuous emissions monitoring systems installed in the smokestack, and then we can, meter and make sure that these things are switched on the whole time rather than turned off. Similarly, in the forestry sector, through satellite photography and aerial photography, we can get some measure of we can get an overall picture of land use changes in Brazil or Indonesia, where there may be changes in forestry, and through the photography we can gauge which tree species are there, so we can get some rough idea of what's happening for the carbon that's either being released through deforestation or that's being stored through land use changes. So I guess in principle I think that these are problems that can be overcome if we give developing countries incentives for them to want to be in the agreement because they benefit up front. This compensation will be phased out over time, but in the near term they'll want to be in the agreement because they're better off. They want these transfer payments and side payments, and therefore it's in the interests of both parties to come up with some scheme for measuring fossil fuels and various downstream activities for capturing the emissions. And then again on the historical emissions, I mean that's obviously a really important point, but again we can have independent analyses saying, well, suppose that we force rich countries to pay a price, say $10 per ton for all emissions they've released into the atmosphere, or we can say, well, you got 50 years worth of emissions into the atmosphere for free. What would that be equivalent for other countries coming into the agreement? You could work out roughly how much was effectively unpriced for the rich countries under different prices for CO2, $10, $20, $30. And again, I'm optimistic that there would be some scope for bargaining over what would be a fair price to to transfer to developing countries to say, well, you didn't get these early emissions for free, you have to pay for all the emissions, and therefore you justified in obtaining some compensation. But we can work out what that compensation would be under different emissions prices, and I guess I'm optimistic that we could work out some fair scheme that would be acceptable to both parties, given the incentive, if they have incentives to want to be in this agreement.
Bob, did you have something you wanted to
Yeah, well, first of all, the first question is sometimes called the legacy question. We've put CO2 into the atmosphere. We have raised the CO2 concentration by a third relative to the pre-industrial time. That's a very particular amount of carbon. The legacy numbers are not that, if we really took them into account in some serious way, they would not make a big difference in the way we're thinking about the world. 50 years ago, we emitted 5 times less CO2 than we do today, 1950, compared to today. So we have done most of those emissions in the last 50 years. We were already pretty developed in the U.S. in 1950, with emissions that altogether hadn't amounted to very much. I'm talking fossil fuels, and it's harder to figure out what our deforestation costs, and so on. There's perhaps 2/3, 1/3 industrialized and developing country emissions up to now, and already 50-50 or 55-45 in favor of developing countries. It's emotionally charged, and we should say legacies need to be taken into account when you're talking any international audience, because it diffuses something. But quantitatively, it's not a very big deal. And the developing countries' self-interest, 2 more things than the ones that were mentioned. First of all, developing countries have real potential for damage from climate change. They have their own very serious risk management questions, because the worst alternatives are pretty terrible in terms of losing of river flow and things of that kind all over the developing world, including the transitional countries and the poorest countries. And most of what we're talking about in terms of carbon markets is about those richer countries. And the other is self-determination. There is something not very pretty about these CERs, where you go into another country and you cherry pick. If they have their own carbon policies, they determine how their countries run, and they drive their own investments toward efficient buildings, toward efficient power plants and so forth, some of which the West participates in, some of which it doesn't. They're in charge of their own lives. So we have this 2-tier world institutionalized in the Rio Convention, 1992, 16 years of it. It was the best people could do. In this city, they negotiated it. It was the best they could do for various reasons that I hope historians will pick apart. But it doesn't solve the problem. And so we have to go past the 2-tier world in 2012. And that's somehow going to, and this is the right group to start thinking about, really, or to continue thinking about how we actually do it. I want to say one last thing, because there is an extra problem that I've become aware of that I'd like this group to think about. When we talk about the U.S. and we talk about the next 10 or 15 years, we have a lot of sunk cost in our power system. And nobody wants to retire any coal plant or any nuclear plant, but rather the entire political momentum is toward life extension in both. 300 gigawatts, 300,000 megawatts of coal, 100,000 megawatts of nuclear. If we take efficiency seriously, we may not need much more power in this country if we also refuse to retire anything. And so we have people champing at the bit in the nuclear community building the next generation of nuclear plants, in the coal community, not them, but people joining them, like me, put the capture and storage, attach capture and storage to new coal plants. And we've got the renewables people with all kinds of ideas of how to add hundreds of gigawatts of renewables. That's going to happen mostly abroad, I'm afraid. Now, therefore, our own technological frontier is going to have to be expressed abroad if we can't retire existing plants. And that feature is unlike any developing country's feature, where they're building new stuff because they haven't got much in the ground. If we love life extension, we haven't confronted the implications of loving life extension in both nuclear and coal. That's a lot of power that is going to be kept there. And you know how these industries are going to behave. They'll put almost anything on as a bargain to keep going because the tire plant is written off already. So we have to think about that as a special U.S. issue in carbon management. I don't know the way around it. We will. It obviously makes more prominent the idea of capturing CO2 from an existing coal plant, for example. And that requires technologies that we know how to, that are pretty expensive, but then issues we didn't build the coal plants where the carbon capture where carbon storage was nearby in many instances, not some instances yes, some no. People talk about the plant itself not having a lot of room around it. We'd much rather start fresh, but we've got this enormous sunk cost.
Well, I know there are a host of other questions out there, but given the time and the Council's desire to keep on time so you all can keep to your schedules, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it, but you always want to end it with people wanting more. So you'll come back again. I want to thank our panel. I think you couldn't have had a more excellent group. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for watching this Council on Foreign Relations video. For additional audio, video, and transcripts of CFR meetings, as well as expert analysis of international news, please visit us online at cfr.org.